a little bit, I want to give a recap of where we've been over the past several weeks as we look at the book of Genesis. We started out about 4 weeks ago looking at the introduction to Genesis. That was pretty in-depth as we looked at who wrote it. So that would have been Moses compiling that. And I gave you notes about the Toledotes, that the different sections that are in Genesis and how those stories were passed down. And the construction of the book, the date in which it was written, the contents in there. We had an overview of the book of Genesis. Then we jumped into the origins of the universe, and that was looking at verses 1 and 2 as we've seen that God said that he created the heavens and the earth, and we looked at the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters, and we looked at all of that dynamics that God created the universe, which consequently, as I've said before, is one of the things that makes the Bible unique in the sphere of holy books, because no other holy book talks about the origins of the cosmos, the origins of the universe. They talk about the earth, they talk about humanity, but they already use things that were here. And so we looked at that. And then we looked at dating creation. And again, both sides trying to lay out why one side believes in billions of years, why another side believes that it's about thousands of years, and kind of looking at the fact that both sides can't necessarily be right at the same time. And then last week we looked at the creation of the expanse in those verses. So God, in last week, God was teaching us about how he stretched out. He created the heavens and the earth. He created the cosmos. And then he said, I'm going to put a bunch of stuff in this, and I'm going to stretch that out. And that stretching out was when he created space. He looked at it. He called it sky. And then that was getting things ready to be able to hang the sun, the moon, the stars, and all the rest of the planetary and solar systems in that expanse. And we looked at the separating of the waters to see I have no earthly idea and no heavenly idea where the waters above the firmament or the expanse are. You will maybe find out, or maybe we won't, but the waters below is what we'll be dealing with today. I said last week that on creation day 2, that is the only day that God did not declare everything to be good. That's because he wasn't finished with his separating of the waters yet. We'll look at that tonight. So that's why we're going to be discussing the creation of land and plants, and we'll be in creation day 2 in the book of Genesis in verses really 9 through 13. And God's going to pick up where he left off on creation day 2. It says, starting in verse 9, and God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. So in verse 9, again, God's picking up from day 2, and you see him separating the waters here. And it says, though, that he's separating the waters under the sky. Now, other translations, and many other translations besides the NIV, will say heavens there. And we talked about this on last week when we discussed the Hebrew words that are out there. And so I put in your notes again today that the Greek word that we studied last week, shemayim, is also used in verse 1. It says, and God created the heavens and the earth. That heavens word there is that Greek word shemayim, and it's also used in verse 8 that we looked at on last week, and that said God called the expanse sky. So when he was naming that stretching out that space, he looked at it, he said, okay, we're going to call that and name that sky, and that's the Greek word shemayim. Rakia is the word for the expanse. The King James used firmament on that. And so sometimes you'll say, he put that in the firmament of the sky. That's the expanse. And then that's what we just look up and what we observe with our own eyes. So the shemayim is the name that God gave the stretching out. The stretching out is basically the process by which he went through to create what you see. So again, you'll see sometimes the Bible translating that heavens or sky, and we looked at last week how the King James put that as capital H and heaven proper, where the place that God is at, and that's not necessarily the case. Verse 9, when it's using this word here, and it said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place. In context, that's talking about our atmosphere. So the atmosphere of the earth has already been created. That was created on day 2 when he separated the waters, and that made our atmosphere. I ended with that last week to say, yes, that is when our atmosphere was there, but it also expands all the way out. So you see God here separating these waters, and it goes on to say that when he separated this, it says, let dry ground appear. So what did he do? I put a bold question in your notes, and it says, did God move the water out of the way so that the dry ground could be visible? Or did he move the water to one place and then at that time create dry land?
He moved it. And the earth, then the land appeared.
So what does it say?
It says, let the water under the sky appear.
Huh?
And let dry ground appear.
All right, what did you say?
Mine says dry land.
Dry land. What's it say? But what's it say? What's the
What this one says or mine?
yours?
It says, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth. And the gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God said it was good.
I mean, I can't hardly be devil's advocate because you can read my bullet points down further, but I can play the devil's advocate with you and say that when you read it in the English translation, it says, let the waters under the sky be gathered to one place and let dry ground appear. So does it necessarily mean that he just moved the waters back and there was dry ground? Because there is the theory by Dr. Russell Humphreys, who is a geologist and happens to be a Christian, who believes that the earth was entirely made up of water, and then God used the molecules and all in the water to create everything that was on the earth. And so I know that may not be how you take it, but I'm throwing that out there to you.
If matter cannot create matter, how can water create land?
Well, God would have been using it, so I guess he would be saying that God, used his powers to use it and to create it. I don't think so either, and I just want to put it out there, because if you do study it, out there deeply, you may find Dr. Humphreys has put a bunch of different theories out there about of creation, but I believe that it's pretty clear here of what this is saying. I can read it and say, well, it doesn't say that I'm not going to put inside of the Bible what is not already there. And he says clearly in the waters, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place. He's speaking those things into existence. Let there be light, and all the rest when he's creating. I would have expected God, if he was going to have created land at this point, to say that he gathered the waters into one place, and then he just said, let there be dry land, and not let the dry land appear, which is telling you that it moved. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there. It is that God is doing, as we said last week, he stopped in the day 2 and did not say that this is good or this was good. And so he was continuing his separating of the water. So it flows from day 2 to day 3 that what he did, and it's also scientifically, we know that the earth is made up of solid matter, in the core and all that is molten lava and the rest, but we have land, but the earth was covered with water on day 3, and God come in and moved the water back, and then boom, having done that, exposed the land. Do y'all see it that way?
Yes.
I think it's pretty clear, but again,
Especially when it says let the ground appear.
yeah. I had never heard of anything else.
If it wasn't there, how can you refer to dry ground? Let something appear.
Well, he's going to name it in a
Dry
minute.
ground, and it appeared.
Yeah. It was there. So, I agree that it's here. Like I said, I don't argue the point in the notes, but I wanted to make sure that y'all were of the same opinion. I don't want to hide things from you. I want you to be able to make up your own mind. But I just don't know what necessarily was holding up the water and all, except for maybe gravity, and he has all the theory about how God did that, and there's reasoning that he uses out there. I just think that he's taken a little bit of liberty with the text to go that far with it. I believe that God created the earth as a solid mass, had water covering it, and then God moved the waters back, and there was dry land. Yeah. So again, I try to take as plain a reading as I can, and there is no scientific evidence that we have of what we can observe that goes along with Dr. Humphreys, but we can observe in science that there is crust, there is mantle, there is solid matter here on earth, and it would make total sense that at some point the entire earth was covered in water, and actually science has observed that, and they speculate that was the case at some point on the planet. So there again, I don't use science to inform my reading of the Bible, but I will read the Bible, and I can see where in science it may confirm what the Bible said, but I don't do the inverse and try to interpret the Bible based on scientific observations. I gave you an illustration here in your notes of the geologic interpretation of what may have taken place. This is a rendition from Answers in Genesis, but you can find this in any scientific magazine that you would like. The geologists today believe that there was one solid landmass. Most people think of Pangaea. You've heard about that. But that's not the first supercontinent that geologists believe. They believe it was Rodinia. And that was this huge landmass that you see on the top left-hand side there. And over the course of time, there were some catastrophes or whatever that broke apart a little bit, and then it got smashed back together, they believe. And that's where Pangaea comes in. You'd have to get into plate tectonics and all the rest of that stuff, which is not applicable to what I'm trying to teach tonight. But then over the course of other catastrophes and the plates slowly moving apart, over time, now today, you have the continents that are a lot further apart than you see now. Some of this drifting, obviously, is not the full reason why the continents are so dispersed now. The water levels also expose more land depending on what's taking place at the time. But I wanted to put out here for you that it is from the Bible. It would appear from, if you'll go back, Joe, to verse 9, that God separated the waters out, gathered them into one place, and it would appear from the text that there was one landmass. And we actually see that in geology, whether you believe in Rodinia or Pangaea or whatever. We wasn't there to observe it, but we can tell when we look at geology that everything's connected together. And let me tell you why this may be important. Because you're going, why is he showing us this stuff about geology and one landmass? One of the attacks against Noah's Ark is how did the kangaroos get from Turkey and the mountains of Ararat across water to only really be found in Australia? You ever thought about that? They all were on the ark. The ark landed on Mount Ararat. If there was that much water between the continent of Europe and Asia and Australia, I never seen a kangaroo swim that far. All right. So it makes sense from the text that it was one landmass in the beginning and even after the flood. And that's what they say, that God separated, and that the Pangaea was a lot of flood sediment and all the rest. I don't get into all of those minute details about it. But in order for you to explain, you would have to say, hey, there was one landmass, and it just so happens that independent secular science confirms, they're not trying to confirm the Bible, but they are, that all the land masses were together at one point, and they're still slowly drifting away. And I go, Isn't that awesome? Because that explains how the kangaroos got to Australia. And you don't find kangaroo fossils or anything outside of Australia and New Zealand. You ever thought? So you haven't thought about that before, right? So there you go. Sometimes there's a method. There is a method to my madness. Why I'm saying something that sounds, pretty off the Bible.
Sea creature fossils in the Sahara Desert.
Yeah.
So that would tell you that there's been water there, and
Mm-hmm.
it was one landmass. Of course, they're saying they're 6,000 years old.
Oh yeah. There's marine fossils that are being found on top of mountain ranges. So.
Part of the pyramids, they scraped away part of it, and it has little minute sea creatures in it.
And they may try to explain that because it was in the mud that they used when you build the pyramids, but you can't. I don't know that you can find marine fossils on top of mountains unless that mountain was covered with water at some point in time. So again, you look at what we can observe in natural history and in the world today, and I'm telling you, at every juncture, I see science confirming the Bible and what the Bible reads. So again, when I look at this, just picture what God may be doing here. And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place and let dry ground appear. Now you say, well, how did he create seas? If you look at the picture, if you go back for just a second, Joe, in either Pangea or Rodinia, it's one land mass, and you can have different, if you want to call them seas. We have the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. Aren't they connected? I mean, they're connected. We just call one part of it the Pacific and one part of it the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, the Arctic Ocean, and all of those different ones. Our whole body of water system today is still connected. So when you go down and you continue to look at what God's saying, He names the seas and all. And in verse 10, He goes and says, and God called the dry ground land. So there you go. And He gathered the water, and the gathered waters He called seas. Well, when I first read that before, I said, well, you got different seas. And you have, like we have still today, the Mediterranean Sea, the Baltic Sea, and all the rest of it. But they're always been connected. We call them different names depending on where you are. This whole idea about God naming, He continues to name stuff. He named the expanse sky. He named the dry ground land. He named the water, the seas. In ancient Hebrew, and even today, when you name something, that is showing your proprietary ownership of that. When somebody discovers a planet today, what's the first thing they want to do? Name it. All right? I mean, they want to be the one that names it and puts their stamp on it. And, the Hubble telescope was Edwin Hubble, and he observes a lot of things. You see it all throughout history. They want to put their name on a new discovery, a new, invention or whatever. And God is saying, here, I'm naming this stuff. It's mine. I've got the power to name it. So I'm just bringing out that little jewel there. He's ending this with that missing good from day 2. Here it is. He's now done separating the waters. He separated the waters above the expanse from the waters below the expanse last week. He's now separated the waters on the earth's surface and created dry land. And now that He's done separating water, He looks at the earth that is now no longer formless. It's still empty, but it's not formless anymore. As we see in verse 1, He said, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And in verse 2 it says, and the earth was formless. Well, now it has form. It's got some dry land. It's got some water on it. It's taken some shape here. And He looks at that and He says, that was good. So that ends His separating work. We're still in creation day 3, though, and so He has more things to do. If you were going to go and plant a garden, what do you need to do first? You got to have some land. Okay, it's got a bunch of grass on it. You got to move that. You got to get that up. You got to till it up. You got to have land to plant. I mean, I've never seen somebody in New York say, I'm going to buy me about 10 acres in New York City and I'm going to plant me a garden. Unless you're going to take a part of Central City Park. I've been to New York City, and I doubt very seriously that you're going to get 10 acres of land in New York City that's not in Central Park. So it'd be very difficult to be able to do that. You'd have to get you some land. So God, logically speaking, if he's going to put plants on the earth, he wasn't going to plant it in water. This is not the Okefenokee swamp. He is going to plant it in dry ground. If we're going to grow food, we had to have dry land. You see a method to his madness here. He's creating. He's doing it in step order. We got to have this. So he puts the dry ground out there. So logically, what's his next step? In verse 11, he says, "Then God said, let the land produce vegetation." Whoa, where did that come from? Now we're just going on this like a stepladder, isn't he? And seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds, and it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. This isn't really complicated stuff here, folks. I mean, in verse 11, he created what we would call today biology. He created the plants. He started life. And I put life in quotation marks and here for you to take that word a little bit with a grain of salt. And God did not require natural processes. What I mean by natural processes is things that you and I are required to do today to make something happen. All right, so God did not require there to be a seed that was planted in fertile soil and there to be sunlight and water and all of the rest of this kind of stuff in order for the first tree to grow. He did not need an acorn. He didn't have an egg first to make a chicken. The first chicken was whole and it was mature and it was going on. So the same thing with the plants. It says there, he said, let land produce vegetation. He didn't say let vegetation appear. He said, let the land produce vegetation. And again, he had to create that dry ground to be able to do that. Now, and he says, according to their various kinds, and it was so. And if you jump to verse 12 just really quick here, what happened? When he said, let the land produce vegetation, what happened? He said jump, the land said how high. He said, I want a tree 100 foot. The tree grew 100 foot right there, instantaneously. It was a mature tree.
Well, the first time I ever read this, I always thought just about the seed. I didn't think about the mature plant.
Yeah. If you were to cut down this tree, the first tree, and you cut it down, and you went to count the rings, it would be one at best, you know. And also, just to let you know, every ring is not 1 year. It's pretty close, but it's one growth period. So you may find some trees that have way more rings. Some trees have less rings depending on the water and all the stuff. Sometimes things stunt growth depending on the seasons that happen out there. So it's not an exact science to cut down a tree and say 100 rings that's 100 years old, in that way. But you would not find there to be a bunch of rings. It would not have had a growth period yet. It was 1 second old, but it had maturity in it. It was a fully grown tree. Now, so when you look at what verses 11 and 12 are talking about here in creating these plants, I want to make this distinction between life and nefesh type creatures, okay? If you don't have, really, we think, well, that plant is alive or I killed that plant or whatever. A plant does not have a living soul, all right? It is different. It's not a nefesh. That's the Hebrew word there. It is not living in that sense. And I put Psalm 37 and verse 2 out there for you, that plants really don't die. They wither. And he put this up here for me. Thank you, Joe. For like grass, they will soon wither. Like green plants, they will soon die away in that way. But plants just wither. They don't die and, some spirit left the plant in that way. That's an important distinction because he does make plants for food. And people say, well, how could plants, there was death because plants were dying. I have never in my life cried over a cucumber whenever I cut it up. But the other day when I caught a catfish and I had to bust him upside the head with that hammer, I thought, oh, I hate to do this for this poor fish, in this way. But I fried him up just the same a little later. All that, but it's been a minute since I cleaned the catfish, and I had forgot that you got to be so cruel to those things and skin them right there. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Is that what you're trying to tell me, Linda? I'm sorry.
You were talking earlier about the tree and the ring.
Yes.
Could it have been, like you said a couple of weeks ago, about the earth, that maybe God didn't create a brand new earth, that he created a mature earth, just like he created a 30-year-old Adam, and he could have created a mature tree that already had the ring.
He could have, yeah. Yeah, he could have. But that's what I was saying about the tree rings. The tree rings do the growth period of that particular tree to see as it expanded out. And that tree wouldn't necessarily have to have the rings. But he could have definitely put rings in there. You're right about that. Yeah.
Just going back because that explained a lot to me when you said that.
Yeah.
He didn't put Adam on earth and make it.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't necessarily have to put the earth, create the earth as a brand new plant. He could have created a earth that was already mature.
Yeah. One of the things that when I was in seminary, I said that Dr. Elmer Towns, who's the co-founder of Liberty University, made a profound statement. I think I said that day that he said that God made the earth in the appearance of age. One of the things over the past week when I've been studying is that some people, and it's still correct, but sometimes when you say that, the secular world says, oh yeah, God deceived us because it looks like this one way, but it's not really. And so I took that point when I say that to make sure I explain that it's mature. And really age sometimes has an appearance. I mean, some people really mess up my age one way or the other, how old I am, depending on how I may act at the time based on how I look. But that doesn't mean that I'm that age. So that's where I went back to the maturity thing. If you had to ask me a definitive answer at whether it would have rings, my assessment would say no, because it would not have had growth periods outside of that one. But going back, it could have, as God put it out there. So yeah, the point is God can do whatever he wanted to do, because that chicken, he has every appearance when you look at it as being, a couple of years old, but he was just created in that same way. So when you cut it down, could that still appear that way? Yeah, I think that you're right about that. Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm sorry, Glenda had said a while ago, I didn't see you, and she had pointed, and I kept looking, but nothing. So she was trying to help you out. Okay, but so when I look down at what God is doing, and he's making these things mature, and you think about life and you think about plants, he created the plants for food. All right, that's an important distinction. That was the only thing that was given to us, we'll see that later, for us to eat. And I have heard some people argue that, death was in the world because we were eating plants. There is totally a distinction in the Bible between plants, animals, and humans. There are only certain animals that have nefesh, have a living soul. God breathed into them a living soul. And animals do in some of the same way have that soul like you and I have, as far as the breath of life is concerned in them. Plants do not have what the Bible would consider the breath of life in that. So again, the only reason you should cry over something is if you're cutting up an onion because of the stuff hitting you in the eye. But so when you look at the plants, though, plants, we kind of talk about them, like I said, when it comes to them being alive, but that's semantics. But plants don't require their own food. Plants take H2O, which is water, and they take carbon dioxide, and they produce food for themselves through the process of photosynthesis with light going in. It breaks down the water molecules and it produces energy. A byproduct of these plants that are in here, and that when that sun hits them and it breaks down those molecules of water and the carbon dioxide, the byproduct that is then put out is oxygen. What do we all need? What does every living creature need to continue to live? Oxygen. So wouldn't it make sense that God would make plants that's going to produce oxygen before he started making living creatures that need oxygen to be able to live? And now somebody says, well, right there, Corey, right there, you just messed up because he has not created the sun yet. Nope. The sun comes next week, all right, in day 4. It's not a problem. You going to say something? Oh, I'm sorry. Now I'm looking. What did you say? The sun is a light bearer. When did he create light? The first day. He said, let there be light. All you need for photosynthesis is light. God's not stupid. He started everything with light, and I'm not saying he needed to see, but he turned the light on first, okay? When he went in there, he said, let there be light, and then he started creating. I don't know, was it the Shekinah glory of God, the light coming from him that Moses seen and his face was glowing and all that? Some people say yes, that it was God's light that provided it on the earth. I'm not sure, or either he just created light itself. He created the entity of light. Your cell phone light camera, these lights in here, they're not light. They're light bearers. They're light producers. When you turn it on, the electricity happens. But they are not light in and of themselves. God created the entity of light. It was here on day 1. And then, we've already had 2 days where it said there was evening and there was morning the first day. There was evening, there was morning the second day. We've about to end in verse 13. There's evening, there's morning the third day. All I need is light shining on the earth rotating to get a day. All right. So there's no contradiction for God making the sun and moon later. He would need to do it this way. And I trust his perfect wisdom when it comes to this. He's filling the earth right now. He's putting the plants here. The plants are doing this process of photosynthesis. It has bugged scientists for years and years and years because they cannot replicate photosynthesis in their laboratories. They cannot. They can bust that H2, the 2 hydrogen atoms and the oxygen atom. They can bust it like the light does, and they can explode it. But when they do that in the lab, it destroys the photosynthesis component of it, and it doesn't produce energy. And some things I read today, the process of photosynthesis is 97% efficient as far as what it brings in and how it produces out. We wish these air conditioners were 97% efficient right now. The EPA would wish anything we had was 97% efficient. And it's something that God designed. Here you have, and I think I put it in the notes, and this comes from one of my commentaries. Plants are self-replicating solar-powered food factories. All right, that's a couple of bullet points. It's right above where I've got CO2 in there. They replicate themselves. A plant doesn't need to go out and grab any food. It doesn't need to eat something else. It just needs to have what's in the air and what God's already created. It's got light. It has oxygen. It's got a little H2O out there, and it can live. Also, people say, well, how did a plant live with a day without sunlight? Again, I said it had light already, but let's just say the earth was dark. I believe these plants will live a whole full day without sunlight. They won't live 1,000 years in darkness, though. So if these days are long periods of time, again, that poses a problem. That if you don't understand that about the light, you're telling me if these are ages, that he created the earth, he created plants, and forever ago, later, he created a sun that had light that made the photosynthesis happen. 24 hours still makes sense to me when it comes to that, or a normal day, however you want to put it. So day 4 He goes and creates the sun and the moon and all of those things. They were not here on day 3. And again, it's logical because of what God would need. He now, when he's looking at the earth, he has dry ground, he has seas, he's going to put animals in the water, he's going to put animals on the dry land. They're going to need food, which he's given vegetation. It's here. Now the earth has form. Now the earth is beginning to be filled. It has the plants. It is ready to now, as we get into a couple of days, to now start putting living creatures upon the earth. He does say in these verses, if you look, like in verse 12, the land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds. And I bring to your attention in your notes too, that he continues to say throughout verses 11 and 12, that it's seed bearing. It's a seed bearing plant. The trees bearing fruit, with seed in it. Why is he saying that? Why does he keep saying? Look at verse 11 for me, and let's look at all these seed times here as it puts it. Guys, let the land produce vegetation. What? Seed bearing plants. Trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds. And it was so. Verse 12. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. He created the first tree. It had acorns on it so that the next tree would grow, and the next tree would grow, and the next tree. He had all the fruit that already had the fruit on it with the seeds in it so that life would be kick-started now. Okay? And they would produce the way that they needed to. That's not an addition to the scriptures, and it's over and over and over the seed. And we know you couldn't have had another thing happen later. He also created the animals. I guarantee you he created a male and female so that they would be able to have the seed. Who has the seed when it comes to biology and for us? Who has the seed, men or women? The males. I was just making sure. The males. The women have the egg. All right. Just like with the plants, you've got to have the same processes that are taking place out there, that you need components to come together. God made it that the creation had to work together. All right. And so he would have done that. He wouldn't have created all males. That's why, again, you get into the fact of different types of sin that are out here today. He created us male. He created us female. That's the only way life produces going forward. And so it just makes total sense that that's the way things are supposed to be. But he created these seed-bearing plants. Again, they're mature. You've seen the first banana. It was a full banana. Maybe green. I don't know. Maybe if you got a yellow one, the green ones are terrible.
Okay, I want to tell you something about seeds.
Mm-hmm.
My dad was a farmer. A row of corn here, a row of corn here. But one of those rows of corn corn has tassels on it, right?
Yep. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, when the wind blows, the male row of tassels fertilizes the female. So you've got corn.
That's right. Yeah. So even in the plants, you have that same process. Yes, ma'am. When you look at the seeds and you look at it, it says according to their kinds. We're not going to go into detail about this tonight, but this is important for plants, and this is also important for animals. He created them according to their kinds. They are to reproduce according to their kinds. And what I will say to you is when he created that, and he created the corn, for instance, corn is not going to reproduce cucumbers or wheat. It's going to produce after its kind. It's going to produce like it. Now, you can take corn and different types of corn, and you can I grew peppers one time. And I didn't follow what my granddaddy had always taught me, and I planted 3 different kind of peppers, and I had some weird combination of peppers that grew because of the cross-pollination against those peppers. But guess what they still were? Peppers. I had no process of cross-pollination that I looked down, and it was broccoli. They may have been a different looking pepper, but it was still fundamentally a pepper. So the same thing with dogs. You have different kinds of dogs, but they are all dogs. And you don't see anywhere through creation, plants nor animals, to where you can mess with the genetic code and make it be something totally different. That is one of the biggest things that is wrong with the theory of evolution. Evolution presupposes that you, through natural selection, should be able to take something, a primate for instance, or going through the step process, and these things that are totally different becoming something later, that is totally different than themselves. You don't see it. You can create a mule, can't you? A donkey, I should say. What can't that donkey do? It cannot reproduce. You can create a liger, which is a cross between a lion and a tiger. It can't reproduce. Every time we do that, and there may be some few exceptions, I won't say every single time, but the vast majority of the time when you have something and you're trying to come over the line of kinds, there is a fundamental block within the DNA that stops it. You may get it, but it'll never continue, all right, on there. And God put that inside of our code to do that. And again, you see that when you have plants, and you see that when you have animals. So he produced things, and they were going to then reproduce according to their kinds. Again, that's important for us as we go forward. And lastly, I was just ending on the points that when he created all of this, again, it's mature, it's fully formed plants. He's going to create the garden a little bit later. Adam's going to have the ability to watch the garden grow in front of him. And so God didn't need to do this by natural processes. He's a supernatural God that did this through his sovereign power. And that is why when he's looking out here at this creation that he has just done, he's able to say at the end of, and in verse 13, he ends it this way, and he looks at all of this, and he says, and there was evening, and there was morning. The third day, the end of verse 12, he said, this is very good. That's what I meant to talk about. And the end of verse 12, he says, this was very good. He was not looking at something that happened through natural processes and saying it was very good. That tree coming because an acorn fell down and it grew up or whatever. He's looking at it because only he could create this way. We're trying to replicate stuff by using his material, his matter that we have today. But at the end of the day, I always pose a question to secular people about where did the first atom come from? And I'm talking about the atom. Where did the first molecule come from? It had to be a creator God that did that. We continue to postulate by using stuff that was already here. But I believe the Bible from the very first verse. In the beginning, God created. Right there, I believe that. I believe it because of what it says. And I look out, and I love to look out into the creation, and the creation screams that God is real and that God is sovereign. And I think that we are foolish to not look at that and see. And then again, as he ends in verse 13, he just is letting us know again that this is an ordinary day. And for the third time, he says this evening and this morning on the third day. You have the construction of evening and morning with a number, with the Hebrew word yom. And I'm just again telling you that when I look at it, it just, and what you were talking about, Scott, that your last name is Scott, Mr. Scott, when you're talking about the appearance of age, that chicken and the egg thing is what gets me too. You just know that there had to be a chicken to make the first egg on there. We see that, we observe it. Science is looking at all of this stuff. And when I read the Bible, I'm looking for these type answers, and there it is. There it is. And I can't understand why more people, I love science because, like I said again, it confirms to me the Bible. We'll get into next week in Creation Day 4. We'll look at the sun, we'll look at the moon, and all of those things, and see why did he make those. Only one reason. There's only one reason he made the sun and the moon and the stars, and the scriptures say it. I'm not going to give you the answer today, but it's not to bear light. Okay? It tells you plainly. Read it and see. Let's pray.